In 1912, Jung published a book in which he said, in strong language, the spirit of evil is negation of the life force by fear. Only boldness can deliver us from fear, and if the risk is not taken, the meaning of life is violated. And I've said to people, if you type that up and put it on your bathroom mirror and you look at it every day, you're going to become a little more mindful of the role that fear, typically through avoidance, is running your life. Don't judge the fear. Recognize that you also, as a conscious being, have an agenda to expand your life in the face of that fear.
Wow. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. And today, I'm joined by no other than Dr. James Hollis. Doctor, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, it's a privilege to be with you, Alex. Thank you very much.
It's my honor as well. And today I had a weird dream, Doctor. I was like in a parking lot, and all of a sudden I felt chased, and then all of a sudden I wasn't. A lot of things happened there, and I woke up with energy. So I'm wondering, how do I interpret my dreams? Are they a source of truth, or they're just an entertainment, like they're the unconscious version of Netflix in the modern world?
Well, I don't think many of them are that entertaining, so I think we don't know what dreams really are, although we have some speculations. One of the things that I've found fascinating, and that is if you live to be 80 years old, and I'm 84, you will have spent 6 years of your life dreaming, which is stunning. Not sleeping, that could be up to a third of those 80 years, repairing the muscular tissues and processing emotion and so forth. But 6 years, and nature doesn't waste energy, so we have reason to believe that it's serving some purpose. And I think there are at least, and this is my speculation, the speculation of others in my field, that first of all, it's about processing the immense stimuli that bombard us in any given day. We have to metabolize all that, so the system keeps working. And again, sleep research tells us on an average night cycle, we will dreamt about 6 times a night. So there's a lot of material being processed there. But secondly, and more importantly for our conversation perhaps, when you pay attention over time to your dreams, you begin to realize there's some intelligence there. In fact, there's a brilliance there from time to time. And it's seeking somehow to communicate with us. We get separated from ourselves. And if I were to believe for the moment that there's something in me that maybe knows me better than I know myself, something in there that's seeking healing and expression in the world, then it would make sense to pay attention to that. Now, that doesn't mean that conversation is going to always please us or will reinforce what we consciously think or feel. In fact, it might very well critique what's going on, because nature has a point of view and our culture has a point of view, and the collision of which has been haunting human beings for as long as we can track back. So just as it matters to pay attention to symptoms in your body, which is after all a statement by that autonomous other that something's amiss there. So if you ignore that, it's going to be at your peril sooner or later. But if you pay attention to your dream, and you'll notice I'm not interpreting your dream because we're not in therapy. They're very personal, very intimate.
Yeah.
And there are parking lots and there are parking lots. So an awful lot has to do with your personal experience, your cultural experience, and so forth. So as Jung used to say, we don't know what a dream is saying to us, but we'll sit here together and sort of work with it and begin to see what kinds of emotions are stirred by our conversation, what images, maybe what experiences are attached to some of those images that are there. And over time, we can back our way into some understanding of why it has come to us. And then you are invited to a conversation that's deeper than consciousness to consciousness. It takes us into the root of what it means to be a human being.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot to take in. And I've said I started the introduction with previous guests as well in terms of dreaming. I'm so interested in that subject. I've had neuroscientists and I asked them about my dream as well. And it's always interesting to hear different perspectives on them, because I myself, I've kept a dream journal as much as I can every day or weekly, at least just write one dream. And I've noticed that every time I write something, I realize that on the outer sphere, like in reality, the cues of the dream start appearing more. Like some themes start reappearing, and at the same time, the dreams themselves become more vivid. So there's this feedback loop, in the sense that I am resting, I am dreaming, but at the same time, there's the unconscious itself is speaking to me. And so, what's the best approach in terms of engaging with dreams? You say that it's a feedback loop, and you say that nature never skips on using energy. And so, as modern life keeps getting more complicated, how can we tap into the power of our dreams, into our own journey into the sense of self?
Well, that's an important dream, and there are several things to think about there. First of all, I've often said to individuals who've had a dream that perhaps reaches out and sort of grabs them, I will say, did you make that dream up? And of course, they'll be a little offended, as if I'd accused them of plagiarism. Or did I plant it in your brain? Of course not. Of course not. So where could that have come from? And the answer, we don't know, but it opens the door to the possibility that there's some other cluster of energy there that seems knowing in a way that exceeds that of consciousness, and which is, again, trying to communicate with us and inviting a conversation. So that's the first step, and that's being humble enough to take it seriously. Notice how quickly people are willing to say, oh, that was on the television last night, on the evening news, or such and such happened to me at the office. Well, that's one of the ways the ego consciousness pushes away this radical proposition that there is, again, something in me that knows me better than me, and it comes out of the depths, which are especially fathomless in a way. Now, the dreams are products of nature, and nature is not particularly interested in making us comfortable, but it is seeking its own expression in the world. That's why I said before, I think the human psyche has two intentions. One is self-healing, but secondly is expressing its own nature in the world through us. Now, if we thwart that, or the environmental conditions block that in some way, it's going to produce a collision inside of us, and that'll reach the surface as symptoms. For example, depression. I had the lovely experience at midlife of having very serious depression. It's what ultimately led me out of academia and the life of the mind, which I loved still, but into a different kind of work over time, because I had to ask the question, not how quickly do I get rid of this depression, but why has it come to me? Why has the psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support from the agenda that my conscious life is serving? And that's a humbling experience. That's not necessarily making me feel, as if I'm on top of the world. Quite the contrary. It's a call to accountability. Let's just say that you have a certain talent or a certain interest in life, but the attitudes that you've internalized or your external circumstances block you from doing that. Well, it's not going to go away. It's going to pathologize in some way. Remember, pathos is a Greek word for suffering. So it's going to cause suffering to that organism, and that reaches our eyes or ears by way of symptoms. So from an analytic standpoint, we don't say, how quickly do I get rid of this, but why has it come? What changes might it be asking of me? And that's where accountability really has to be weighed into the factor. If I'm not going to be accountable for what is essentially the wisdom of nature within, then nature's not going to be friendly to me. So the obvious, cliched example of that is a person who pursues career success, whatever that might look like, as a kind of monomaniacal attainment of self-worth or a position in society or something like that, and then hits that depression or winds up in self-medication or as a series of bankrupt relationships and so forth. We realize that person unwittingly has in some way produced that injury, that internal separation from his own soul. And when I use the word soul, that's just the literal translation of the word psyche. So the psyche involves our bodies, our emotions, our spirit, and the purpose in life too. So It's a kind of all-embracing term, and it has to do with the core being of that individual, of which we know only a sliver of possibility through conscious life.
Wow. And absolutely. It's as if the dreams themselves are also like a portal into what our soul yearns to express itself in reality. And I really resonate with what you said on in terms of seeking success and optimizing life for success and building a career. I myself had a quarter life crisis previously, very recently, where, you know, my own definition of success just changed completely. How I want to spend and honor my time on earth was really defined. And I remember one of the breaking points where I decided to action in terms of what happened within me was I woke up in the middle of the night asking myself, if I had a year to live, would I be doing the same? And it was a resounding no. And so there's this inner song within us that wants to be heard, and throughout life, the unconscious itself tries to steer us into that route, so to say. And like you say, sometimes we just internalize the definition of who we should become in the reality by circumstance, by context, even by system, like system wide. You know, a lot of people have to optimize life in terms of economics, making a living. And so this dance between trying to integrate that sense of self that tries to express itself, you know, through dreams, through cues, and then at the other side there's the cue of the ego. We could discuss it in that way, or the external, asking us to sort of survive in a way. And so, doctor, how can we navigate this little dance and slowly but surely trying to integrate that sense of self more in the daily life?
Well, again, a huge question, Alex, and a good question. Sometimes I've said to individuals who are just starting the process, do you realize that many of the choices we make and the patterns that we develop are rising out of internal clusters of energy, what we're called complexes? When you hear the word complex, don't hear anything negative. It's simply a structure loaded with some energy that has some feeling connected to it. It shows up in your body. It can be measured literally, like the polygraph, for example. And most of all, it has an agenda of some kind. So you tell the child, don't touch that iron, it's hot. Well, sooner or later, it's going to touch the iron and get an experience. So from that moment on, it has a complex, a cluster of history. We have complexes because we have history. Now, some of them play out in useful and supportive ways. You look both ways before you cross the street. But on the other hand, many times we're making decisions about career, relationship, or the dynamics of our relationships as if an 8-year-old child were in service to a certain view. You wouldn't say to a child, you can have my automobile for the day, just don't wreck it, because we'd say the child's not old enough to make that decision. But decisions and judgments are being made by those stories that we acquire, many of which are from childhood, many of which are from our popular culture, many of which are from our personal experience, which will vary, obviously, from individual to individual. But when those clusters of energy are triggered for outward source or inner source, they have the power to rise up and take over ego consciousness. And once in a while, a person will stop and reflect, why was I so irritable yesterday? We say, what came over me? Or I don't know what I was thinking when I made that decision. That's some grudging recognition that there's another government system inside of each of us. And if we don't pay attention to that, then we are just living unconsciously. And a lot of it, our life is based on, reflexive responses, because that's what produces the outcome is a reflexive response. So of any particular complex, one has to ask that question, what is this in service to in my history? From whence did I get that emotion-laden idea? And a very practical question, what does it make me do, or what does it keep me from doing? And when I can ask that question, usually we know the answer to that. And if you don't, you keep asking it until it reveals itself. And then you realize, all right, now there's an agenda for me to address. if I'm repeatedly undermining myself in some way, or there's something I wish to do with my life, and yet for reasons I don't know, I can't do it. Well, it's very important to ferret that out, because that's the presence of complex. If a person's feeling a creative block, for example, or they're not having full permission to feel what they feel and desire what they desire for their life. These are all examples of things that are common to all of us. So part of what we have to do is start mapping the complexes. And the simplest way to start is to look at the patterns in your life, because you don't rise in the morning and say, well, today I'm going to do the same stupid counterproductive things I've done for decades. But the more it's unconscious, you can be sure that it's eating your lunch. It's going to exercise its agenda and not necessarily yours. So a lot of these complexes, as you can imagine, are fear-based, meaning they help us defend or having experienced in the incursions of the world, with those things that flood our boundaries, or which threaten us with abandonment and so forth. Those are the two life-threatening circumstances. And out of that comes a whole cluster of subsidiary or satellite energies or complexes. So you have to say, all right, where in my life am I avoiding conflict? Not many people like conflict, and those who do are very troubled. But where am I avoiding conflict and therefore undermining my integrity? Where am I accommodating? I've often joked we were all raised to be nice people, and a nice person reflexively, you see, is acceding to the power of the situation or the power of the other at the moment. And a lot of nice people get pulled into non-nice behaviors or complicities. Or where am I seeking to gather power and take over this situation? So it gets to be very complex. And then you say, oh, well, I just don't want to worry about that. Well, all right. Then your life is on automatic pilot. I remember a billboard campaign in New Jersey when I lived there about 30 years ago by the State Dental Association that said, ignore your teeth and they'll go away. Well, ignore these clusters of energy. They won't go away. They will continue to create those patterns. And where to start is, where do you undermine your own self-interest or legitimate needs? Where do you do hurtful things to others, perhaps? So those are the ones to start with. Now, you can say, I don't know where that's coming from, but at least you've opened the door to that inquiry. And you'd say, now, what could account for that behavior? And then some possibilities begin to emerge. And that's why you wait for the person to feel that inner resonance, or that click, as people have said, where you say, oh, yeah, I think this is what this is about, you see.
It does seem that to get to that click, to get to that eureka moment where there's this window of opportunity to truly take a step back and don't react, like you just mentioned previously, and have the ability of introspectively examine, why am I behaving this way, or why am I reacting this way, or what is this feeling, what's the cue of this feeling in terms of what is he trying to say. And so the concern here is that many people, I don't want to generalize, but it seems as though it's not a universal truth that everyone gets to experience that introspection, or have the ability to, or the skills or the tools to open that window towards introspectiveness. It seems that many people don't realize that they're on autopilot mode. Like they've been the same way their whole life, and up until it boils, like you say, and nice people become resentful and angry, but that's like there's no other way in their sight that this could be different in terms of how can I serve myself in the best way to serve others. And so my question is, how would you suggest someone to be able to open that window of introspection, to be able to say, hey, this might be something that I can learn from, rather than something that I should react to in daily life?
Well, first of all, we need to always recognize that there are contextual, environmental, cultural definitions that have caused people enormous suffering. Gender definitions, what you're allowed to do as a woman, what you're allowed to do as a man, what you can't do as a woman, what you can't do as a man, etc., that have been powerfully stifling influences throughout history. There have been social, political organizations, institutions that have suppressed people's natural instinctual desire for life and for more abundance. So we need to recognize that at one level, this is a luxury to be able to examine oneself. On the other hand, it's a necessity because something terrible then happens to the soul of that individual. So somewhere in one's life, and you won't hear this sentence very often, that's for sure, one of the virtues of mortality, the fact that we're here a short time, can sometimes really quicken the spirit and say, well, I better pay attention here. This is, as far as we know, this is the one we get. That's the only thing that we know about. If there's another life, it's another life. It's not this one. This is the only one we really know for sure. And to say, all right, look at the degree to which fear is governing my life or lack of permission. I find most individuals don't have permission to have their own lives. They may be very functional adults out there, have a nice resume at their corporation or, have all kinds of people who around them who care for them, etc. But inwardly, you see, there is often this conditional sense you're okay if you meet the expectations around you. Because as children, we learned that, if I learned as a child speaking up was going to result in a punitive experience in some way, I just start shutting myself down. I monitor myself. Or if I have to rush in there and try to fix the situation. And that's part of the background of many people in the helping professions, whether it's medicine or clergy or psychotherapy or social work or whatever. They're often a child who became acutely sensitive to the dynamics of the family and or the outer culture, and often wind up deferring their own growth and their own life in service to trying to fix the environment. In the forlorn hope within that child that we carry within, that if I can fix you or fix my family or the family of humankind, then it will be there for me. We can have a reciprocal relationship, but as you know, the troubles out there are infinite, and my capacities as a caregiver are limited. So there's always a level of stress and asymmetrical relationship there. There's always the demand of the environment, you see. How do you deal with that? So at some point, one has to decide, is my journey meaningful to me? It doesn't mean easy. It doesn't mean conflict-free or pain-free. Is it making sense of my inner reality? And if it isn't, what do I need to do to change that? Because if you don't do that, you're in some way participating in an abuse of life itself and the opportunity. A good example of that, in 1885, Tolstoy published a novella called The Death of Ivan Ilyich, a name that means something like John Johnson, meant to be an every person kind of thing. And Ivan is a person who received from his environment, his social class, expectations. This is who you are. This is who you're supposed to marry. These are the values you're supposed to have. This is the neighborhood you're supposed to live in, and here's the career path for you, et cetera, et cetera. And he did all those things, and the author, Tolstoy, says several times, everything's flowing the way it's supposed to be, as if there's a kind of contract we are signatories to, and when in fact reality tells us there is no contract. Stuff happens. And so at the peak of his development as a socialized being, he has this pain in his side that doesn't go away, and then we learn it's a terminal case. And he asks for the first time, what if I've been living as wrong? And no one wants to talk with him about it because it's his problem, not theirs. They're busy living in their false self, so to speak. And so his only reality is in those last 3 days where he talks to an illiterate peasant who was signed to be his caregiver, because all the others distance themselves and so forth. And so why would Ivan Ilyich have been published in 1885 unless Tolstoy had seen all around him. A denial of mortality. Secondly, a kind of adaptation to the commands and dictates of your culture, starting with family of origin, but moving out and widening circles of religion and education, the zeitgeist and so forth, all of which form a provisional sense of self. But on the other hand, there is the self, with a capital S, not to be confused with the ego, that has another agenda. And that's what produces this inner distress. That's why a person can achieve everything they're supposed to achieve, as Ivan Illich did, and inwardly feel empty. You see, and that's what, again, speaking to some kind of intelligence within us, the wisdom of nature that is seeking its expression in the world through us. If that's not there, then all we have to do is be like a chameleon, adapt the circumstances around you, internalize them, and you're good to go. You become an automaton. But something inside knows better, something protests. You can climb to the top of the ladder, as Joseph Campbell pointed out, and realize the ladder was placed against the wrong wall,
Wow. Yeah, a metaphor that comes to mind is from a movie that I wrote about, Click, with Adam Sandler. It's not a comedy, but he's a funny individual nonetheless. And the metaphor that he mentions is the cornflakes, the leprechaun, where he needs to pass the rainbow, and on the other side of the rainbow there's a treasure. And then he optimizes his life towards getting that treasure all the time. So he passes the rainbow and just realizes that when he gets there, they're just cornflakes. They were cornflakes all along. So it was a life, you could say, a lie all along, a life with a lie. And Doctor, you mentioned the word fear, and it seems as though that's, at least in my experience, I can speak about that, but generally also it's one of the, you mentioned two, and one of those was fear, that sways us from discovering who we truly are, or how can we, show who we are in the world, or live through that creation, that creativity. And so a lot of us do optimize for getting away from that fear. But how can we use that as a cue in terms of, what is it signaling to us? And at the same time, how can we become an ally of, I'm not saying fear in the sense of, there's someone hunting or chasing me like my dream, or there's actual danger. But in modernity, it seems like a lot of those fears are just in our minds. And so how can we consolidate those into our sense of self?
Sure. Well, first of all, fear actually is necessary and protective. Otherwise, you'd walk right up to the tiger and say, nice little kitty, and the tiger has another agenda.
Yeah.
Or you walk right in front of a car. And so if you don't have some fear, you're at high risk, that's for sure. On the other hand, most of our adaptive personalities, notice I said adaptive rather than natural, are driven by protective measures such as avoidance or accommodation or trying to get control of the situation, one of those three, and with 1,000 variations for each one of them. But on the other hand, in 1912, Jung published a book in which he said, in strong language, the spirit of evil is negation of the life force by fear. Only boldness can deliver us from fear, and if the risk is not taken, the meaning of life is violated. And I've said to people, if you type that up and put it on your bathroom mirror and you look at it every day, you're going to become a little more mindful of the role that fear, typically through avoidance, is running your life. Don't judge the fear. Recognize that you also, as a conscious being, have an agenda to expand your life in the face of that fear. Now, fears are specific. Anxiety is amorphous. And other animals might fear predators or fire, for example. and we do, but at the same time, we can imagine other possibilities that don't even exist at this point, right? I mean, I don't think there's an animal on the planet worried about a meteor coming to Earth and destroying the whole civilization or something like that. But we do, at least metaphorically.
Yeah.
And so what we do then is tie ourselves up in knots with that. And then the real question that comes up over and over and over, what does that fear make me do? What does it keep me from doing? Then we have to say, is it going to govern my life? Do I step into the larger journey that life asks me? Because in my own family, for example, who were through the circumstances of fate, denied education, were impoverished, and the core idea of our family was, don't go out there. It's too dangerous. You'll get hurt. Stay here and we'll take care of each other. It was like circle the wagons and we'll try to protect each other. And that was, a rational response to their experience of life. Even as a child, I knew, and I couldn't have articulated it at that time, but I knew that was something too small, that I needed, and I say this lovingly, not judgmentally, needed to get away. And of course, the first step in getting away was going to college. I was the first person to ever be able to go to college and pursue education for the family. Subsequent years, I lived in a different place geographically several times, and my parents were very upset when I published a book, because rather than see that as an accomplishment, they saw that as their child out there now, and subject to critical appraisals from others, which for them would have been devastating, and which placed all of us in harm's way. So you can see that was one of the complexes, that is to say, internalized experiences with a lot of energy attached to it, that I had to cross a boundary, step into the fear in order to step into a life. Now, I say this again lovingly because I do understand the circumstances which dominated their experience, and their love and instructions were protective of their child. But again, something in me, even as a child, knew this is too small. When an airplane went over, it was a big event for me. This is a long time ago, of course, but I would run out to see where the airplane was going. I was so thrilled. I remember thinking, someday I'm going to go where the airplanes go. And one of the things I've learned is that where they go is other airports, and then you have to go to a hotel somewhere and wait for your taxi to get back to the airport, you get home, etc. But I've been privileged to have opportunities in my life that they never had. And some of that's the changing cultural climate, for sure, but a lot of that was the willingness to take that risk, to step into it. Jung said once, we all walk in shoes too small for us, and I think intuitively we know what that means. It's like I live protectively most of the time, reflexively. Now, don't blame yourself. That's a logical outcome of what you've had to deal with. On the other hand, and this is the challenge to consciousness, that leads too small of a journey for you. You're going to have to face what you fear at some level. I don't mean this in a literal way. If you're afraid of heights, you have to go skydiving or something like that. That's just a literalization. It's saying, but where am I frightened by stepping into what is calling me? And something inside is afraid of that, resists that, shuts it down. We all have that Hamlet complex in us. That is to say, there are times when you know what you need to do, but for reasons you don't know, you're not able to do it. And I'll tell you, it comes down to one bottom line. When people reach those stuck places in their lives, you're going to have to face something that triggers anxiety in your psychological basement, and it will reach up as a fear-based then to produce a behavior such as compliance or run away from this challenge. And you have to know that link is there because it's mostly in the unconscious. And by definition, we don't know about the unconscious. We can only assume that it's operating based on the choices and patterns we produce. So it's incumbent upon us to say, where I'm being governed by fear, there's my agenda. Doesn't mean just do the opposite or run into some precipitous and disastrous outcome, but it means, all right, I need to know this is a challenge for me. This is an agenda. Now, I'll just give one other example. The message of my childhood, don't go out there, allied with a natural introversion as opposed to extroversion, always produces in me a conflict. But if that dominates, then I wouldn't be in an interview with you. You see, this pulls me into the outer world in a way which I find meaningful, or I wouldn't be doing it. So it's the perception that meaning is more important than happiness. Meaning is more important than, feeling safe and secure. Meaning is more important than fitting in. And sometimes if you want your life to be meaningful, you have to step into what is difficult for you. But one last point, if it's right for you, you will find, no matter what the outer outcome is, something inside of you rises to support you. And Jung also said something that haunts me in a constructive way. He said, we all need to find what supports us when nothing supports us. When your outer circumstances are not what you thought they were, or they're not supporting you in a way that helps you through something, then you have to go within and find some resource there, some resilience that rises to the challenge. Because our natural agenda is to express itself in the world through you. It's not about making you happy or accomplished. It's about calling you to accountability for what wants expression through you.
Wow. Thank you for that. That was really enlightening, and there's a ton there that we can discuss, and it's, I'm being pulled into many questions at the same time. So I'm hoping I'm choose the right one here, but
What will happen if you don't?
we'll open a new
Pivot, right?
yeah, we'll open a new pivot, I guess, a new route, and it's fine. But it's the I think the overarching theme of listening to you right now was that we do have a sense of agency in life, and that sense of agency can be nurtured from within, and also being in tune with it's funny because, like you say, we don't have to jump from a cliff to get past our fear of heights, or we don't have to do, I really like comedy, stand-up comedy, so I don't have to do an open mic every time to get past that fear. It's interesting because what I'm starting to realize is that throughout our daily lives, those situations happen, and we can either, engage through that feeling, engage through that intuition of, what's my calling in this situation, because, not always we can become an actor or whatever to lean into that calling, if I'm making sense, but it's on the daily life itself. And the sense of agency comes into play because nowadays it does seem that there's a lot of, like, it's funny, I just said that I'm being pulled into different parts, but the world is very, very rapidly evolving. It's just moving a ton of places at the same time, and so how can we harness that sense of agency where we can, decide what is good for us, that what works for us, even though maybe the world is moving into a technological future where, we might live forever, and these advancements make us feel that we're being left out of the innovation. But let's say I'm interested in learning more about Jung and about psychology, and I want to pursue a master's in psychology. So how can we harvest that, doctor?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, first of all, you have to recognize that your choices matter, and there are internal resistances to those choices as well, sometimes outer resistances, and you're going to have to face those one way or another. It's fair to say the only constant in life is change. So one needs to recognize that every day we are called in some way to a new set of circumstances. And, our fullest life, as well as I think the future of any culture, depends on the capacity to work with change. And there's a question I've often asked people to consider. And it poses itself this way. How now am I to address this set of circumstances, whatever they may be, in the face of which I may have no utter control? But it's a summons to, again, accountability. Now, to give you a specific example, I've had 2 patients in the last week with some serious cancer diagnoses that may put their lives in peril. That's natural for that to get one's attention, you can be sure. And you can see how the mind begins to run down the road there and imagine all kinds of negative outcomes, some of which are, of course, potentially truthful. However, the question is now, since we're mortal to start with, how are you to live your life with fidelity, with courage, with integrity, and with as much productivity as you can in the face of these circumstances over which you have no control? That's the circumstance that we all face on a daily basis. It's just once in a while it reaches up and grabs us, and then you have, a real crisis of the situation. And the stronger the ego, I mean by that, the more rigid the ego, because the more rigid the ego, the more it's going to be neurotic. That is to say, separated from other aspects of itself. But the stronger and more mature our conscious life, the more we're able to tolerate change and work with it. Because the ego is basically driven by the need for understanding, management, and control. And change itself undermines those certainties. In fact, there are no certainties except change. So I can either get into a regressive mood, whether that's in a religious institution or a social reaction, and think, well, I'll go back to my previous position. That's what Freud called the regressive restoration of the persona. Let me go back to who I was and what I understood at the time, because at the time it kept me comfortable or made sense to me. Well, the truth is, it's no longer true for you. You're in a different world. You're in a different reality. Now, how are you going to cope with that? And that implies, to some degree, and forgive the cliche, you have to go with that flow and see where it takes you. And what are the tasks that it brings to you in that situation? So, for example, if you have an illness, a chronic illness, well, you going to have that illness or is it going to have you? That's a big distinction. I went through 2 cancers and several surgeries on the spine a couple years ago. And I continue to do my work because my work is meaningful. So I was getting radiation at 7 in the morning, and I was back in the office by 9 because I was, on the one hand, facing mortality, but on the other hand, saying it wasn't going to define who I was. I will try to define those, not from an egotistical standpoint. If it was, then you're simply caught in an internal conflict. It was saying, this is what I need to serve in order to, in some way, embody my own calling, my own capacity. There's a big difference between job and vocation, as we know. A job is how you pay your bills. Vocation is what you're called to as a human being. It's not a single thing. It's many things. You could be a parent. You could be a citizen. You could be whatever. But in the long run, we need to serve something larger than us. And by that I mean that we have some story or some value that is larger than we are. And by that I mean that it serves our, daily ego needs for security and protection and so forth. But because of that, our life is richer and deeper than it would be without it. So I think of my work as an analyst is a sacred profession. I don't want to, make it sound glorious. But, as a child, I couldn't have imagined spending my adult life. I thought it'd be a Major League Baseball player. Well, I didn't get the body for that, right? So I couldn't have imagined spending hour after hour talking with people in their suffering. On the other hand, what is more honorific? What is more meaningful than be part of the journey that somebody is going through and share that journey? And those are relationships that often go far deeper than parent-child relationships or marital relationships or whatever, because they are where the soul is up for grabs, you see. What's going to own my soul? My adaptations, my fears, or a willingness to commit to the journey that seeks expression through me? It's not what my parents wanted or what the culture would recognize or support, but it's something in me that I wish to honor. And that's humbling, not aggrandizing. It doesn't make you feel on top of things. It makes you, in the best sense, a servant. And if you're not serving something large in your life, you're serving something small, because we ultimately serve it. And most of the time, I think it's almost inevitable, we are in service to our complexes. The story the 8-year-old had about life, about who you are, who I am, and what's the nature of the traffic between us. So if we have any enemy in life, it's the unquestioned power of history within us. And if we don't recognize that's where we have to address our engagements with life. As a character in Faulkner says, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. You see, we're not dwelling in the past. It's that the past hasn't left us. The past and its reverberations continue to make choices for us. One of the books I wrote years ago was called Hauntings. And the first sentence is, we all live in haunted houses. That is to say, we have psychic clusters of energy. People have this sort of cliched notion that you lie on a couch and complain about mom and dad. Well, that's not what it's about in any way. However, when you begin to examine the skyscraper that you've accumulated in your years on this planet, the bottom floors are always that family of origin stuff. Where did you get a sense of the other? Where did you get a sense of who I am? Again, what's the nature of the traffic between you? And, the infant's reading this. The little child is reading this world, trying to make sense of it, and he or she develops reflexively stories. So if you're not looking at me and valuing me, the child may internalize the notion, it's because I'm not worth paying attention to. Or if when I open my mouth, there's an agitated response, well, I learn to just shut down my own feeling function or my own legitimate agenda. And you can't overemphasize the degree that these early archaic responses become institutionalized within us. They become our first reflex. That's why we pay attention to symptoms and dreams and so forth, because that's the psyche weighing in with its perspective. If you didn't have, psychic response, we would simply be, as I said before, creatures of adaptation. And then you're at the mercy of whatever the world is bringing to you.
Wow. And you mentioned the past, and it seems that's a good segue into discussing love in the 21st century. As cheesy as that sounds, that's how I wrote in my questions. But it seems that a lot of people, and I've had my own fair share as well, that we repeat the patterns in relationships. It's one of it's very interesting because it's like the most in-your-face way of noticing, if you can notice that you're repeating past relationships and maybe not the desired ones. And so that in itself is point one. And point two that I wanted to touch, which I'll bring into my question, Doctor, is at least my generation, Gen Z, and we've grown with social media and instant gratification and building this persona in social media and, through likes or dislikes or posting a picture, carving up an identity based on social media.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems as though we're connecting more with the persona than the person in my generation, which is very frightening because the question that I wanted to ask you is, and you've written about this extensively in your work, is that in terms of love. But how do we know as a generation and individually speaking, how can we truly know when we're able to see that other person, build that relationship, not with a persona, but with an individual? And at the same time, how can we know if we're truly finding love and not just, an idea, a concept, but truly deep love?
Well, another small question there, Alex. There's so many aspects to this, but first of all, what we were just talking about was the formulation of a de facto sense of self. That is to say, who I think I am, who I think you are, and not even necessarily consciously who I think you are, but again, how I've been conditioned out of those early experiences. Do I trust the other? Do I distrust the other? Can I be myself with that person, or do I have to present myself in a certain way? Those are not conscious questions, but they are being addressed already because the child had to try to figure that out based on the circumstances to which he or she was exposed by fate. So often our sense of self rises out of what environment we were, put into by fate. Now, that's going to be brought into every relationship. And the more the relationship matters, the more intimate the relationship, the more that primal material is going to be evoked. And you can't help but have the child's stories present between any two people, frankly, messing it up. Because, in fact, you could say it's unfair to relationship, that it's constantly having imposed upon it the stories, the limitations, and the agendas of one's past. And it undermines, even if I have a big body and a big position in society, I'm still being run by those stories, basically. So, there's a huge distinction, as we know, between being in love, which is that state of possession when you meet someone who lines up with your inner configuration. But you have to remember, too, that could also include, I had a very troubled, maybe abusive history. Let me find someone to repeat that. See, one wouldn't do that rationally, but people do that all the time. Do you have permission to be in that relationship in a complete way? What part of you is being held back and why? What part of you is afraid of dealing with a conflict that inevitably arises out of two people meeting and so forth? So all relationships begin with projections because the other is a total other, a mystery. We don't know who the other is. And so we fill in the the gap, the hiatus there with our own psychological material. And when you said, why do relationships often turn out the same way? It was because we're bringing the same sense of self and the accompanying stories, i.e. complexes, that are going to recreate it. And, you can move to another person, but you still have that material. And most of the time, we're looking to the other to be here and sort of fix all that for us. It's what in the book on relationship, the Eden Project, I called the search for the magical other. The magical other is ultimately going to be the good parent. Know us, take care of us, protect us, read our minds, be there for us, comfort us, help shield us from having to grow up ourselves. We don't say these things, but they're in the unconscious agenda. And they ultimately sabotage the relationship. And then the question is, when the in-love state erodes, as it will, with time and familiarity of the other, is there something truly worth loving in that person? See, there's a difference between the in-love state and loving something. Because loving someone means you need to be there when they're less pleasant to be with. Joseph Campbell made an important distinction once where he said, if you keep sacrificing for the other, you'll grow resentful. But if you're sacrificing to your joint project, it can fill you with enthusiasm and with purpose, so that we together are here. And I would say the definition of a healthy relationship is each of us is committed to supporting the growth and development of the other person. Now, long term, that needs to be reciprocal for the relationship to be healthy. But to care for my wife and support her growth and her development is number one, because if I don't, I'm going to be living with an unhappy, depressed, angry person. And to have that kind of reciprocal relationship coming in my direction as well, because you both grow larger that way. Does the relationship diminish the person? Does it make them larger psychospiritually? This is why I would not automatically applaud a long-term relationship, a 50-year marriage or something like that, because you have to ask, and outwardly we usually don't know, what happened to the soul of that person in that relationship? Did they grow and develop? Or was something forever constricting it and damaging it? Maybe they were replicating some of their original life experience. Who knows? So that's why, in effect, we need to recognize that all relationships begin in projections. A projection means my history is evoked, whether I'm aware of it or not. It leaves me and goes out onto the other. And then transference is the second phenomenon where, given the complex, making a choice here or being the lens through which we see the other, in comes the history from the past. So the transference is bringing that history. So I might have controlling behaviors as a way of trying to manage my own distress, and that's hurtful to the other. Or I have compliant behaviors, let us say. Codependence is a common example because every child learned, in this world I'm pretty powerless, so I better try to fit in as best I can and let them have their way. So that's keeps me out of harm's way. You bring that to a mature relationship, and that person's diminished by the relationship per se, because we're bringing to it that history that operating unconsciously can only repeat itself. And to break out of that, you have to step into your own journey and be accountable for your own stuff. Now, if I were appointed emperor of the universe, which is not going to happen too soon, I would say you can't start dating till 50. You can't think of getting married till you're 70. And you have to be at least 90 to have children, because you sort of need to figure out who you are first. That any relationship could really work is a small miracle, given the capacity for sabotage from our history. But some relationships really do. And the in-love state dissolves, and it's not that it's totally gone, but it can dissolve, and what's left is something you really cherish in that other and feel the reciprocity of that. So it's very complicated, as you can see, but everything in your life ultimately, and this is not navel-gazing, this is being responsible. Everything in your life comes back to the issue, are you really working on yourself to figure out what are the search engines at work in your life, and what are the familiar patterns that are there, and can you ultimately address them in a way that you lift it off of your career or your children or your partner or whatever. Jung said once, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. So where I'm stuck, it will be both a direct and an indirect set of instructions to my children. You get stuck at the same level. If I can't do it, you're not going to. Or that child is going to be spending a lot of time trying to break from that, you see. So the real question then is your life enlarged in that more is asked of you, that the gift of the relationship is the dialectic with the otherness of the other, if we can bear it. And that's not easy. That's why a mature relationship is hard to achieve, because I'm not infantilizing the relationship. I'm not trying to get the other to take care of me, except in an overt way. If I'm medically compromised, it's reasonable to expect the other to help, etc. But ultimately, they're not here to take care of me. I am. And when I do that, then I have plenty of energy to left over to help take care of that person when they need it too.
Wow. Yeah, I'm hoping that, generationally speaking, my generation and younger generations just are able to get to that maturity point quicker, in the best way possible, because again, I don't want to blame the outer situations or whatnot, but really we are growing through these technologies, and they are really changing the conception of even the sense of self, not only in terms of other people, just the sense of self, how we define ourselves. And Doctor, I'm beginning to be aware of our time. I know you have a tight schedule, and so I just want to thank you. Thank you for joining me. I do hope we do have another chance of discussing, because like you say, and like you've seen, this is one of the topics, sense of self and becoming who we truly are. It really ignites me. So, and your work has done that for me as well. And so thank you. And I will hope to host you again soon. I'm very, very grateful for this conversation.
Thank you, Alex. Let me just add a footnote here in the light of what you said a moment ago.
Yes.
If I'm defined in any way by the number of likes a person has on their social media, then what we're really saying is There's that kind of sabotage. We were talking about relationship. I'm expecting you to do something that I'm not addressing myself. It's my job, even if I can see all of my flaws and shortcomings, it's also my job to like myself. I know it sounds sappy, but if I haven't addressed that consciously, I'm going to be counting those likes. And it's a natural thing to do, but ultimately it keeps one stuck in the need for the other to approve of us. If you know you have something in you that knows you better than you, that something is there that will support you through hard times, if you live long enough, they're going to come, then you don't need the other to take care of you. There's an adult on the scene who's managing that pretty well, thank you, and that's also yourself. So it's been nice to talk to you, Alex.
100%. And like I'm sure we can speak for a whole day. So, but I know your schedule is packed. So I'm honored to host you, and hopefully we do this again in the future.
All right. Be well.
Thank you, doctor.